So I kind of addressed this a little bit with the Bully Ray thing, but in general, it seems pretty obvious right now that AEW kind of has a huge faction problem. The fact that a lot of superstars are kind of divvied up and aren't focused on due to the fact that they might be part of a trio, some be part of, the conglomeration, some sort of faction that comes in. And I know that's like a symptom of like a lot of imports from New Japan being already part of factions and stuff like that. But a lot of the times, especially with how AEW is functioning, how it has a lot more multi-man matches, and how they usually can carry weight in terms of a storyline, you would think that a lot of these factions would have a lot more poignance in the show compared to a New Japan, besides really the Death Riders and maybe the Don Callis family, which is still a loosely collected group of heels, really, you know what I mean, where some of them are turning like Andrade. It doesn't really feel like the factions necessarily have any strength, or even a necessity for the wrestlers themselves to feel safe, like in New Japan, right? And AEW kind of, with a lot of these factions, it does feel like an excuse to just kind of have, a trios division, kind of an excuse to have multi-man matches where you can feature multiple mid-card talents that are popular and stuff like that, whereas there should be genuine stories and things happening besides the Death Riders and the Don Callis family having interpersonal relationships and things changing, right, that focus on changing the dynamics between them and each other, right? For example, everything that should be examined across the board for all these factions. The War Dogs, obviously with Gabe Kidd getting hurt, it kind of probably derailed a lot of things, but you don't want a lot of these guys to be reduced to kind of, just pure heels, you know what I mean, or just fodder for the main AEW talent to kind of to get put over by, right? I think that, specifically with a lot of the guys who have come over from New Japan, like your Jay White, like the handling of Bullet Club Gold, for example, you know what I mean, has kind of spoken to the lack of direction that Tony kind of does have a lot of the times when it comes to his pieces on the board that he acquires. I don't think that, there's a lack of long-term storytelling for a lot of the main stuff, but when it comes to, like I said, much of the mid card and many of the obviously the women, for example, there's a lack of consideration, a lack of segments that really give us meat for these characters unless they're directly promoting whatever is going to happen next for them. You know what I mean? Like, you usually get a lot of 3-minute, 4-minute segments, if that, promoting a direct match that's going to be happening on maybe a pre-show or a middle of the card 10 tag fair, you know what I mean? And comparatively to WWE, these multi-man matches are just produced so much better, right? But beyond that, there isn't a lot of meat for these guys to hang on and even maybe carry with social media week to week, which I will give WWE, despite, I think them being the weaker product at the moment, will do so. I think while the wrestling can be boring as hell and a lot of these segments are just aura farming in WWE, the few words we get spoken are trying to push some sort of narrative, and it might not even be a good narrative. It might be half-assed, or it might be literally done to spite fans, but at least there's a vision there for multiple characters all across the card. I think AEW is super top heavy in terms of it's focused on storytelling, and it's focused on that. And I think the factions, with there being so many and so many teams kind of running around, especially with not necessarily identity, but maybe unique move sets and such, but aren't being focused on as characters, everyone kind of gets lost into that mix instead of, having standouts. Like the Rascals should really be a standout, and I think showcase matches with a lot of these tag teams, with like the Young Bucks, for example, is a great way to show these teams. But when it's done all the time and there's no real defining quality to these teams except that they can wrestle, then it all becomes like that they're lost in the shuffle, and that we aren't talking about these other teams as much as we still are talking about the Revival and the Young Bucks, because those teams get proper story. The Young Bucks were in Stadium Stampede, the Hurt Business was part of that as well, because there are certain teams that genuinely get a focus and are incorporated into all of AEW, while there are other teams who are genuinely there just to be there and just to fill in, I guess, for 6-man tags, trio matches. For example, the conglomeration right now, has a bunch of great guys that I think need to be separated, besides maybe the main trio of Cassidy, Roderick, and Kyle O'Reilly, just because they're not really doing anything, and there's no real reason for Willow and Ishii to really be there if they're not really involved in anything, you know what I mean? And to further compound that, you know what I mean? Like, let's look at Tekla's group, you know what I mean? Julia Hart, former TBS champion, Sky Blue, right? Like, these are women who, instead of maybe, just being on Tekla's purse, you know what I mean? They should have proper feuds and storylines instead of us sitting here waiting for Tekla's Stardom opponent, you know what I mean? Maybe we could have had a faction thing with the Stardom people and Tekla, right? For, Tekla basically disrespecting Stardom or whatever the hell, but we're not really getting any context to any of that. We're just getting Tekla coming out, and I guess Tony understands that her mannerisms and stuff are over with the audience, so we're just leaning into that. Another thing I think AEW and Tony is kind of not the best at is, once something is over, he runs it to the goddamn ground. Same thing with Andrade's How You Know. That could be the great turning point to him turning face, but they're already running it into the ground instead of letting him not every week say it, but like, baiting it out even, maybe even the fans are just mouthing it during the promos and stuff on screen because they know they want him to say it. You gotta really build those things up, I think, instead of just running them into the ground as soon as something maybe like spontaneous happens, but I think that then goes back as well to how AEW is handling its factions right now, which just feels disorganized. Besides obviously the Will Ospreay focus on the Death Riders, adding Garcia and stuff like that, why aren't other factions getting this notoriety? Why aren't other factions having similar storylines where they're trying to recruit people, or you know what I mean? Like, everyone was going after Will Ospreay. You had the Ops, you had all these guys going after Will Ospreay, but then move that aside, and where are the Ops week to week besides maybe some Samoa Joe or farming a little bit, and then them trying to get Hook over in an attempt that really isn't working because his personality just falls completely flat. They're not pushing the factions properly. It just feels like these are banners that a lot of people are operating under, in place of any proper story or heat. And I think that's a big thing that is a huge problem in AEW, and I think especially moving forward, if they want, there are the robust cards, right? But I think if we want an investment and we want to create a lot more stars, right, and bigger stars, you're going to have to take the time to take these guys who aren't getting the MJF level reactions and build them up to that point, or build up the context you would have with these guys, right? And that's kind of a little 2 cents on, I think, where AEW kind of stands with their factions and stuff like that, especially since it's extremely rampant and kind of dominating much of the storylines, like the whole Don Callis situation, kind of with MJF holding the belt, but everyone in the Don Callis family kind of wanting some sort of vying kind of thing. And it's like, having the Don Callis family exists, to which essentially the majority of your top heels are in, is kind of a power vacuum that then leads to this situation where they're kind of off on their own, feuding with each other, you know what I mean? And whoever was involved with Don Callis, then really extending out to the greater AEW roster and feuding with them. Okada shouldn't have just had random, international title matches. All those matches, like with Ace Austin, with all these guys, it should have been built up properly with them coming to challenge Okada, or Okada having some sort of relationship with these people, you know what I mean? Instead of like Don Callis making the magic and, Okada's going to defend today. Like, there's no story here. There's nothing to care about, and in my opinion, especially when the novelty of Okada is kind of gone because we've had him here. He's a staple of AEW now. I enjoy the whole thing with Konosuke, right, and Okada, right? But in building that, they didn't do a good job of, the valley of opponents and stuff to get to that moment felt underwhelming. It wasn't until we got the match there at Double or Nothing and we finally got that tease that it felt paid off, but nothing leading up to it really helped build it as much as the one segment essentially that had them, you know, as they were tagging, right, break up, you know what I mean? And it's like, you could have done that at the beginning of the month and then had them feud, and we could have been, you know, anticipating them finally getting their hands on each other, instead of doing a will they, won't they, which then circumvents the rest of the Don Callis family and what they're doing. That's just kind of my 2 cents right now. Definitely still pining for Will Ospreay and Omega at All In, even though despite maybe the nuance that would exist, I think that's the big money match. We'll see what happens though. Let me know what you guys kind of think about what's going on right now in AEW. You know, if you guys think the Death Riders is ass, just kind of like Bully Ray was talking about, and I'll see you guys in another video.